welcome to another episode of Tea Time with the Bible. My name is Piladi, but commonly known as Miss P. Thank you so much for being here. To any new subscribers, thank you for joining us here as well. Please continue to like, comment, share, and don't forget to hit that notification button as well. So with that said, today I'll be reading from the book of 2 Corinthians 12, in particular verse 9 and verse 10. So I'm just going to give you a rundown of what verse 9 and 10 says before we actually start to analyze it further. So reading from verse 9. But he said to me, "My grace is enough for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So then, I will boast most gladly about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may reside in me. Therefore, I am content with weaknesses, with insults, with troubles, with persecutions, and difficulties, for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong." So this is the story of Paul. So just to give you a little background, this is when Paul was, speaking to Christ. And as he's speaking to him, he tells him about, this thorn that he has. So when you look at 2 Corinthians 12, it starts off by saying it's the story of Paul's thorn in the flesh. So in, the story here, Paul is speaking to Christ and telling him that, there's this thorn, that is tormenting me. And the thorn here is referred to as Satan, And, now Paul is speaking to Christ and telling him about this particular thorn. And so he's surprised, Christ replies to him with a promise, actually, rather than taking away the thorn. He promises him, when you look at verse 9, he says to him that, "My grace is enough for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." You see, now that is the part where now Christ promises Paul that all you need is my grace. My grace is sufficient for you. That is God's, promise to Paul in that sense. So, and then when we read further, he says that, so as we go on, this is now Paul replying. He says that, "So then, I will boast most gladly about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may reside in me." So here, Paul is not boasting about his accomplishments. He's boasting about, his weaknesses, so that Christ's power, Christ's grace can actually reside in him. That shows that, Paul is actually dependent on God. He's putting all that he has in God's hand. That is his dependency on God in that sense. And then as we read along, we go to now verse 10. In verse 10, it says that, "Therefore, I am content with weaknesses, with insults, with troubles, with persecutions and difficulties, for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong." So here we can already tell that, Paul is content with the fact that, there are times he'll be persecuted, he'll be insulted for the sake of Christ. But he knows that whenever he is weak, God will be strong for him. Again, he is showing us that he is dependent, on God. He's dependent on Christ. And that is something that I feel like most of us need, to learn. Something that we also, as, children of God, need to take into consideration that, there will be time that you will be persecuted for following God. There will be time you'll be persecuted, insulted, and so many things. But always know that that God's grace is sufficient. That is all you need. That is his promise to you and to me. God's grace is sufficient. So regardless of what people say about you, because they will speak. I remember when I started this channel, that was one of my biggest fears. I'm like, oh my, having to start this channel and speaking about God, I'm afraid of the fact that what if people say this and this and that. But God always, spoke to me using the same words that Paul, now is also confirming, that God promises that his grace is sufficient and you don't need anything else. And him promising that, for me, all I need to do is be dependent on God, knowing that he will be there for me. The same thing I want for you guys as well, knowing that during your time of being persecuted, insulted, or whatever, know that God's grace is sufficient even for you, and that is what you need. So I actually want to touch again on, verse 10. When you look at verse 10 regarding, being persecuted and, insulted or having troubles in whatever sense, this is where we see Paul's spiritual growth. He's giving up everything and giving it to God, giving it to Christ. And in that sense, so basically here, it's a spiritual growth, whereas he's now embracing his weakness. So Paul is embracing his weakness, and hardship, which can now foster spiritual growth, which literally, fosters spiritual growth, and now have him having a deeper reliance on Christ. He's putting all that he has, all that he is on Christ. And that is something I honestly feel that we should also have, as a children of God, because I have so many examples that I can share with you guys in terms of myself. Because whenever I remember when I used to go to Sunday school, because I've mentioned that, I always used to go to Sunday school every Sunday. I would have people who would say to me, why are you always going to Sunday school? Are you trying to be better than us, or things like that? And at first, it would literally hurt me to know that, why am I being persecuted or insulted for wanting to be near God or wanting to be in the presence of God? It would always hurt me in terms of, why would people be so harsh in terms of, I'm trying to live in God's, in alignment with God's ways, but people will always have a negative point of view or things like that. And I always comforted myself with, words from the Bible that, Jesus was also persecuted. Jesus was also insulted by so many people, but he kept his faith because he believed that his Father in heaven will sustain him. Hence why, just like with these, these powerful words that God said, to Paul, that he promises his grace to Paul, his sufficient grace. And that is something I also live by now, knowing that it doesn't matter how much I get insulted or persecuted by people or whatever that is troubling me. I know that God's love, God's grace is sufficient for me. You understand? So that is one of the examples that I also went through from a very young age. You can imagine I was so young and already people were saying these things. But I'm thankful for it because it groomed me to the person I am today. Whenever someone insults me or persecutes me in terms of, oh man, you're always reading the Bible, you're always telling us about, God this or Jesus that, I know where I stand now. Sometimes they say you should keep quiet. The power of the tongue also says a lot, but you should also know where to back down. As a child of God, be so content with, people insulting you about, you walking in with God and things like that, to a point where even when they insult you, you just become silent and know that, what, I know where I stand in my faith. I know that God's grace is sufficient. So people can say whatever they want to say, because at the end of the day, you want to walk into a crowd where you are able, just by you speaking up, they can tell that this is a child of God. That is the most amazing thing, that one could have. And there are so many examples from the Bible where we see suffering and persecution. When we look at the book of Matthew 5, verse 10 to 12, it starts off by saying, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. You see, that is another example of what Paul went through. He was, persecuted. And now God is, speaking back to him and saying, you know what, blessed are those who are persecuted because of doing righteous. Same way, God's grace is sufficient. That is all you need. Also, when we look at Psalms 51 verse 1 and 2, it starts off by saying, have mercy on me, O God, This is where you can see that there's a form of acknowledgement on being dependent on God. This shows dependency on God, because it starts off by saying that, have mercy on me, oh God. You can tell that this is someone who now is, needs God's presence, and they need God's help. Hence why they're acknowledging that, what, God, I'm putting everything in your hands. I am acknowledging the fact that, what, I am in need of your help. Another example that we find from the Bible, again, if you look at Psalms 23 verse 4, it starts off by, Psalms 23 verse 4 says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow, of death. This also shows that, a sense of dependency. You're dependent on God. And this also shows God's sufficient grace, because it takes so much for, one to say that even though I walk through, the darkness, the troubles, insults, persecution, yet again, you see, this is how all these themes actually, line up as one. All these themes show us what to do during suffering, persecutions, insult, but they all lead to one thing, which is God's grace, God's sufficient love for us. You understand? So with that said, today, I want you to also ask yourself these type of questions. When was there a time where you had challenges and trouble, and you felt like you can't do this anymore, and you felt like giving up, and God's grace, God's love showed up? Ask yourself those type of questions. Ask yourself that, where would you be if it wasn't for God's grace, or if it wasn't for God's love? Or you can even read through these verses that I've just read out to you, and try to understand them, like I've been doing, which they have groomed me to the woman I am today. Because if it wasn't for them, if I was back then, like with what I said regarding going to Sunday school and people telling me that, why are you doing this, why are you trying to be better and stuff like that, if I had not walked with God, walked with faith, with his sufficient grace, where would I be? So these are the kind of things, as young Christians or even older, these are the type of things that groom you. These are the things that groom you and grow you as a Christian, and help you in your faith, in your walk. Because trust me, the moment you walk in a room and you are filled with God's presence, and you know his words and his laws, you won't even have to say much for people to see that this child is filled with God's grace. This child is, filled with God's love. They will see God's sufficient grace, God's sufficient love in you, just by the way you speak. You understand? And that is truly amazing. It's truly amazing. So with that said, that is actually the 2 verses for this week, but I'll also write down all the verses I also set examples from the scripture, so that you can also read for yourself and actually have a better understanding. But from my side, that is it. Thank you so much for always taking the time to join me during these sessions. I actually enjoy them so much, and I hope I can be consistent and always do these. And guys, please interact as much as you can also. That would actually help me a lot, and try to figure out if these are also helping you. I'd really like to hear feedback if these are helping you as well. But yeah, thank you so much for joining. Please continue to like, share, subscribe, and comment. And don't forget to hit that notification button as well. But from my side, thank you. Bye.